Imagine a man who has it all. That was William Roberts. Owner of one of the largest construction firms in the country, he didn't just build skyscrapers, he built empires. Seated at the head of an opulent boardroom, surrounded by his top executives, he absorbed every word spoken as if they were pieces of a puzzle he mastered long ago. But that morning, while the graphs climbed and applause filled the room, a single statement cut through the air like a blade. "The public thinks we're a cold, heartless company. They say we don't support the community." The sound of those words thickened the atmosphere. Eyes turned to the young marketing manager who dared to speak what no one else had. A deadly silence followed, as if everyone was waiting for the lion's roar. Yet William didn't roar. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, evaluating the young man who had disrupted the natural order of things. "Explain yourself," he commanded, his voice low and controlled, carrying a chill that made the young man swallow hard. "The public, they think we don't care," the manager continued nervously, "that we're just another big corporation, blind to people's struggles. We need to show we have a purpose, a positive impact, do more for the community, something that goes beyond numbers." Those words echoed in a hollow chamber within William. It wasn't the first time he'd heard something like this, but why did it feel different this time? He, William Roberts, wasn't just a business leader. He was a relentless strategist, a man who had conquered every obstacle to sit where he was. And now, he was being accused of not caring. He hid his discomfort behind a strained smile. "So you think the solution is to simply throw money at social causes?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The directors around him chuckled softly, as if on cue, but the young manager didn't back down. He held his boss's gaze steady. "I'm not talking about donations. I'm talking about understanding, about truly seeing what's happening out there." Out there. To William, that was a distant world, a world he glimpsed only through the glass walls of his office's top floor, as towering as the skyscrapers he built. He had spent years claiming that view, distancing himself from the ground and the small people who fought every day for a scrap of dignity. Understand what's happening out there? What did that even mean? After the meeting, William tried to shake off the unease, yet those words kept echoing in his mind throughout the day. He returned to his office and stared at the city glistening under the morning sun. His eyes, accustomed to scanning for new land and opportunities, could now only see the gulf between him and the rest of the world. Then, on impulse, he made a decision. He didn't tell anyone, didn't ask for advice. He just stood up, picked up the phone, and with a voice that surprised even himself, said, "Get my car ready. I'm leaving in an hour. There's a place I need to go." William Roberts, the man who believed he had everything, was about to find out what he truly lacked. And that discovery wouldn't take place inside his office. It would happen on the streets he had ignored for far too long. No one at Roberts Enterprises suspected a thing. To his staff, William Roberts was simply away on a business trip, perhaps negotiating yet another multi-million-dollar deal. But in reality, he was wandering the gritty streets of New York City, clad in a torn jacket, faded jeans, and worn-out sneakers. His usually immaculate appearance was replaced by an unkempt beard, a hood pulled low over his face, and a thick layer of dirt that had already settled into his skin. William's plan was straightforward: spend a week living as a homeless man. No security, no entourage, no backup plan, just him and the unforgiving streets. This was his attempt to peel back the layers of his comfortable reality and experience what it meant to be invisible. The first night, he found himself alone on a cold park bench, clutching his thin jacket as the wind sliced through him. Sleep was a distant fantasy. Every sound, a car horn, a distant shout, the footsteps of strangers, sent jolts of anxiety through his body. It didn't take long for the loneliness to set in. Despite being surrounded by people, he felt utterly isolated. Those passing by glanced at him and then looked away just as quickly, their eyes flickering with judgment or discomfort. He tried smiling at a few, hoping to exchange a word or two, but they ignored him as if he were a ghost. By the third day, William had begun to feel the true weight of his decision. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, and the small amount of cash he had brought along, just enough to buy a meal or two, was running out. He spent hours searching for a safe spot to rest, only to find each location either occupied by others like him or riddled with dangers he'd never imagined. Once, as he sat on the curb, he overheard a group of young men laughing and making cruel jokes about the homeless. "Look at that guy, probably wasted all his money on drugs," one of them sneered, tossing a crumpled dollar bill at William's feet. Humiliation washed over him, but he didn't pick up the money. It wasn't about pride. He simply couldn't bring himself to acknowledge their words. This was a man who had been used to commanding respect, who had people bowing to his every whim. And now he was nothing, less than nothing. He was a fixture on the sidewalk, as overlooked as a piece of trash. On the fifth day, his journey took a sudden turn. Huddled under a dim streetlight near the corner of 34th and Madison, William noticed a woman sitting alone, hugging her knees to her chest. Her hair was matted and her clothes were stained, but it was the look of utter defeat on her face that drew him closer. He hesitated, then approached cautiously, not wanting to startle her. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked, his voice hoarse from lack of use. She glanced up, and for a moment there was a flicker of something in her eyes, recognition maybe, but then it faded. She shrugged. "Suit yourself. Not like I own the place." William lowered himself onto the cold concrete beside her. They sat in silence for a while, two strangers sharing a slice of the city that had swallowed them whole. Finally, she spoke. "I used to work in one of those buildings over there," she murmured, pointing to a cluster of high-rises glittering in the distance. "Had a nice office, a desk with a view. Can you believe that?" William glanced at her, his heart pounding. "What happened?" "An accident," she replied, her voice flat, as if she were reciting a story she'd told too many times. "Lost the use of my left arm. My company decided I was too much of a liability, so they let me go. I couldn't pay the medical bills, lost my apartment, and, well, here I am." There was a hollow emptiness in her tone that made William's chest tighten. This wasn't just a story. It was her life. A life that had been shredded by a single, unforgiving twist of fate. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Sarah," she whispered. "Sarah Blake." William froze. The name hit him like a sledgehammer. He remembered seeing it, somewhere buried deep in the personnel files of Roberts Enterprises. Was it possible that she had once worked for him? Swallowing hard, he managed to force out the next words. "Do you remember which company?" She let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Roberts Enterprises. Funny, huh? One day you're part of the machine. The next, you're discarded like a broken part." William stared at her, stunned. His world tilted on its axis. The woman sitting beside him, the one he might have dismissed as another nameless face, had once been a part of his empire. And his company, his people, had abandoned her. The city's rhythm didn't care about William's internal turmoil. Life continued to pulse around him, people rushing to work, tourists snapping photos, vendors hawking food on every corner. The chaos, which once felt like a backdrop to his success, now seemed to mock him. It was like being trapped behind a glass wall, watching a world that moved too fast for him to ever catch up. William had spent decades constructing towers that scraped the sky, but down here, on the ground level, he felt smaller than ever. After his conversation with Sarah, he wandered aimlessly, trying to piece together what it all meant. Roberts Enterprises had been more than a company to him. It was his legacy, his life's work. How could something he built with such care turn into a machine that discarded people like broken tools? As the days passed, he experienced the brutal reality of being unseen, unheard, and ignored. He tried to make conversation with strangers, asked for spare change just to see their reactions. The results were all the same: disgusted glances, dismissive waves, or worse, the complete lack of acknowledgement. The weight of invisibility pressed down on him, suffocating. One afternoon, while sitting on the steps of an old church, he watched as a group of Roberts Enterprises employees exited a nearby building, laughing and chatting. They were his people, his team, but none of them even glanced his way. He felt a surge of anger and bitterness. Just a week ago, these were the same people who hung on to his every word, who sought his approval. Now, they walked past him like he was a stain on the sidewalk. He noticed something else too, a certain hardness in their faces, an air of superiority, as if in the confines of their tailored suits and expensive shoes, they were shielded from the reality he was now living. It was infuriating, and yet, wasn't this what he had trained them to be? Ruthless, efficient, focused on results above all else? He had created this culture, fed this mentality. The realization twisted like a knife in his gut. Later that evening, hunger gnawed at him once more. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. Swallowing his pride, he approached a line of people waiting at a food truck that offered free meals for the homeless. The smell of warm soup filled the air, and his stomach churned with a mix of hunger and shame. As he took his place at the end of the line, the server, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, handed him a bowl of steaming stew and a slice of bread. "Thank you," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. "You're welcome," she replied gently. "Stay safe out there, okay?" William nodded and moved aside, clutching the food like a lifeline. He found a quiet spot near a darkened alley and devoured the meal as if it were a gourmet dish. But as he finished the last of the bread, his mind drifted back to Sarah. He couldn't shake the thought of her sitting alone under that streetlight, resigned to a fate his company had handed her. Determined to learn more, he spent the next few days seeking her out. When he finally found her again, she was in the same spot, staring blankly at the stream of people passing by. He hesitated before sitting down beside her, unsure if she would even remember him. "You came back," she murmured without looking up, her voice barely audible over the city's din. "Yeah," he replied quietly. "I wanted to hear more. About what happened. About how you ended up here." Sarah's shoulders tensed, but she didn't push him away. Instead, she let out a long, weary sigh. "What's there to tell? One day I was just like them, rushing to meetings, worried about deadlines, planning my next vacation. Then, in a split second, it all disappeared. The accident changed everything. And when I needed my company the most, they showed me the door." "I'm sorry," William whispered, though the words felt hollow. He wanted to tell her the truth, that he wasn't just some random guy on the street, that he had the power to change everything. But how could he? The guilt was suffocating. It was his responsibility, his failure. His people had turned their backs on her because he'd set the tone. "What about you?" she asked, finally turning her gaze on him. Her eyes, once sharp and vibrant, were now dull and exhausted. "What's your story?" He hesitated, caught off guard. What could he possibly say? That he was a millionaire pretending to be poor? That he was living out some ridiculous experiment to appease his own conscience? Instead, he took a deep breath and gave her the simplest answer he could. "I lost myself somewhere along the way, trying to figure out who I really am now." Sarah studied him, her expression inscrutable. Then she nodded, as if something in his answer resonated with her. "Yeah, happens to the best of us." They fell into silence again, but it was different this time. There was a mutual understanding, a shared pain that connected them, however tenuously. And as William sat beside her, the sounds of the city fading into the background, he realized that this, being seen, being heard, was something he had taken for granted all his life. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe there was a way to make things right, to bridge the chasm between him and people like Sarah. But the road ahead would not be easy. It would demand more than just words or empty promises. It would require change, real, painful change. And he wasn't sure if he had the courage to face what came next. The days blurred into nights, and William's world shrank to the streets he wandered and the people he encountered. He'd seen pain, hunger, and desperation in the eyes of those around him, things that were easy to ignore when he looked down from his office high above the city. But in the gritty reality of cracked pavements and freezing winds, the truth was undeniable. There was no escape from it. And yet, it was Sarah's story that haunted him the most. He found himself returning to her night after night, sitting beside her as if drawn by some invisible force. At first, they barely spoke, but over time, the barrier between them began to crumble, piece by piece. One cold evening, Sarah broke the silence. "You know," she started softly, her gaze fixed on the traffic rushing by, "I used to love coming to the city. There was something magical about the lights, the hustle. I thought I'd made it when I got that job at Roberts Enterprises. It was everything I'd worked for." William shifted uncomfortably, every word a painful reminder of his own guilt. He clenched his fists, keeping his voice steady. "What did you do there?" "Finance," she replied, with a hint of pride. "I handled budgets, helped project future profits. I was good at it too. My boss even mentioned a promotion." Her smile was sad, almost bitter. "But then, you know how these things go. One accident and suddenly you're too broken to be useful." "How did it happen?" he asked, his throat tight. Sarah didn't answer right away. She took a deep breath as if summoning the courage to revisit a place she had long buried. "I was driving back from a late meeting. It was raining and I was exhausted. Fell asleep for just a second." She swallowed hard, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "The car spun out of control. I woke up in the hospital days later with this." She gestured to her arm, which was permanently bent at an unnatural angle. "I thought I'd be fine, that I'd go back to work and just pick up where I left off." She laughed bitterly. "But the doctors said I'd never regain full mobility. Suddenly, I wasn't an asset anymore. I was a liability." William's chest tightened as she continued. At first, they were supportive, sent flowers, even organized a small fundraiser. But after a few weeks, the tone changed. My emails went unanswered, meetings were rescheduled or cancelled. And then one morning I got a letter from HR saying my position had been eliminated due to restructuring. She glanced at him, eyes dark with pain. "You know what that means, right? They used me up and threw me away." "Sarah, he started. But she cut him off. "Don't. I don't need your pity. I just need to understand how I ended up here." Her voice was fierce, almost desperate. "I gave everything to that job. Worked late, missed family events, pushed myself to the breaking point. And for what? To be tossed aside like trash?" William had no answer. He could only sit there, the weight of her words crushing him. His own company, the empire he'd built, had destroyed this woman's life, and she wasn't alone. How many more had suffered the same fate? How many more had been sacrificed at the altar of profitability and efficiency? "Did you ever try to fight it?" he asked gently, though he dreaded the answer. "Fight it?" Sarah shook her head, a hollow laugh escaping her lips. "Fight who? They had an army of lawyers and an endless supply of money. I had nothing. I tried to get legal help, but everyone said the same thing. You don't have a case. Just move on with your life." She glanced around at the street corner where they sat. This is what moving on looks like. They fell into a heavy silence, the sounds of the city blurring into a distant hum. William's mind raced, grappling with 1,000 thoughts and emotions. He'd built his empire on the belief that hard work was always rewarded, that loyalty was a two-way street. But Sarah's story shattered that illusion. She had given her all, and his company, he, had taken everything and left her with nothing. He couldn't stand it any longer. He needed to tell her the truth, to let her know that he wasn't just another vagrant. But how could he do that without making everything worse? How could he admit that he was the man responsible for her suffering? "Sarah," he began cautiously, "I want to help you. I'm not who you think I am." She turned to him, confusion flickering in her eyes. "What are you talking about? He paused, struggling to find the right words. But before he could continue, a commotion erupted across the street. A group of young men, clearly intoxicated, were shouting and laughing as they approached. Their eyes locked on Sarah and William, and one of them sneered. "Hey, look at these losers," the guy yelled, his friends egging him on. "Bet they're out here begging for drug money." William stood up, his body tense. "Leave us alone," he warned, his voice low and controlled. The leader of the group stepped closer, his grin widening. "Or what? You gonna hit me with your cardboard sign?" he laughed, his voice dripping with mockery. Before William could react, Sarah grabbed his arm. "Don't," she whispered urgently. "It's not worth it." He looked at her, then back at the group of men, his pulse racing. He wanted to fight, to defend her, defend himself. But what good would it do? They were invisible here, and any confrontation would only reinforce that perception. With a deep breath, he forced himself to back down. "Yeah, that's what I thought," the leader scoffed, throwing a crumpled dollar bill at William's feet. "Enjoy your dinner, trash." The group moved on, their laughter fading into the night. William stood there, fists clenched, feeling a mixture of rage and helplessness. He'd never felt so powerless in his life, but as he looked back at Sarah, saw the resignation in her eyes, something shifted inside him. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said softly, the words inadequate. Sarah shook her head, letting out a long, shaky breath. "I've been through worse." And that's when William knew. He couldn't walk away from this. He couldn't just return to his old life and forget everything he'd seen and heard. He had to do something, for Sarah, for everyone like her, and for himself. The question was, did he have the courage to face the truth about what his company had become? William returned to his office building with a heavy heart, his mind swirling with thoughts of Sarah and all the others like her, people he'd never seen, stories he'd never heard. When he stepped through the familiar glass doors, it felt as if he were crossing some invisible barrier between two worlds, the harsh streets below and the pristine, controlled environment of his corporate kingdom. The receptionist glanced up and greeted him with her usual bright smile, completely unaware of what he had been through. "Good afternoon, Mr. Roberts. Your 3 p.m. with the finance team is scheduled in conference room B." William nodded absently and stepped into the elevator, the polished metal doors reflecting his disheveled image. It felt surreal to be back, as if he were a stranger in his own life. But he couldn't let that stop him. He had come back to make things right. The first thing he did was head straight to human resources. Pushing open the door, he found a small group of staff clustered around a computer screen, reviewing some document. They looked up in surprise as he entered, and he saw the subtle exchange of glances, the silent communication of people bracing for a reprimand. Mr. Roberts, the head of HR, Susan Miller, greeted him, standing up quickly. "We weren't expecting you today. How can we assist you?" "Pull up the employment records for Sarah Blake," he said abruptly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Susan blinked, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. "Sarah Blake? I'm not sure if I—" "Sarah Blake," he repeated, his voice steely. "She used to work in finance. She was terminated a few years ago after an accident." Understanding dawned in Susan's eyes. She turned to her computer and began typing rapidly. After a few moments, she looked up. "Yes, I see her file. She was let go after being on medical leave for too long?" William interrupted, his jaw clenched. "Is that what the file says?" There was an uncomfortable pause. Susan's eyes darted around, but no one else dared to speak. She cleared her throat and continued. "The official reason was the company restructuring, but yes, there was concern about her ability to return to full capacity." William stared at the screen, his chest tightening as he read through the cold clinical notes that sealed Sarah's fate. He felt a wave of disgust at the process, at the people who had signed off on it, but mostly at himself. He'd created this system. He'd set the policies that allowed this to happen. "Who made the final decision?" he asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. "It would have gone through the CFO's office," Susan replied cautiously, "and then to you for final approval." Of course, he had signed it, probably without a second thought. Sarah Blake had been nothing more than a name on a list of people deemed non-essential, and he had cut her loose without ever knowing the full story. He turned away from the screen, anger boiling inside him. "Get the CFO in my office in 10 minutes, he ordered, before walking out, his steps echoing down the hallway. The meeting with the CFO, Stephen Callahan, was tense from the moment Stephen entered the room. He looked at William with a mixture of confusion and unease. "William, what's going on? I heard you've been asking about an old employee." "Sarah Blake," William interrupted, his gaze piercing. "You remember her?" Stephen hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yes, I do, but William, that was years ago. We followed protocol. Protocol? William's voice rose, the rage he'd been holding back finally spilling over. She's living on the streets, Stephen, because we followed protocol. The silence that followed was suffocating. Stephen opened his mouth to speak but seemed to think better of it. He shook his head slowly. William, I understand you're upset, but this is a business. We make hard decisions every day. Sarah's condition made her a risk. A risk? William repeated incredulously. Do you even hear yourself? She was a loyal employee, a good one, and we abandoned her when she needed us the most. Stephen shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly caught off guard by the ferocity of William's reaction. Look, if this is about guilt, I'm sorry, but we're not a charity. We have to make decisions that... Enough, William snapped. I'm done listening to this. Starting today, we're changing how we operate. There's going to be a fund, a support system for employees who fall on hard times. No one will be left to fend for themselves again. Do you understand? Stephen stared at him, stunned. William, this is a huge policy shift. The board, I don't care what the board says, I'll deal with them. William leaned forward, his eyes blazing. You just make sure the fund is established. And one more thing, I want Sarah Blake found. She's going to be rehired, and not just as some gesture of goodwill. I want her in a position where she can make real change, a leadership role in this new initiative. Stephen gaped at him, speechless. He seemed to weigh his options, then finally nodded, still looking shell-shocked. I'll get on it right away. Good. William stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. And Stephen, remember this. From now on, we don't just build buildings. We build people. Make sure everyone understands that. He walked out of the office, the weight of his own words sinking in. For years, he'd been driven by numbers, profits, and expansion, but none of it mattered now. Not if the people who helped build his empire were left broken and discarded. As he returned to his office, he took a deep breath. This was just the beginning. He knew there would be resistance, backlash even, but he didn't care. He'd seen the cost of indifference, and he would never let it happen again. Not while he still had the power to make things right. The boardroom was buzzing with low murmurs when William stepped in. The executives looked at him with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Whispers had spread rapidly. William had returned from an unexpected absence, and rumors about his strange behavior were circulating. Now he stood before them with an expression none of them had seen before, one of intense determination. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, he began, his voice steady but laced with a sense of urgency. The murmuring ceased instantly, and every eye turned to him. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering on each face. He'd known these people for years, trusted them, relied on them. And yet, standing there now, he felt like he was looking at strangers. There's been a change of plans, he continued, effective immediately. We're restructuring the company's approach to employee welfare and community support. A ripple of confusion passed through the room. One of the senior VPs, a stern-looking woman named Linda, furrowed her brow. William, what exactly do you mean by restructuring? William straightened, every fiber of his being radiating resolve. It means we're going to make our people a priority again. We're setting up a comprehensive support fund for employees who face hardships, whether it's a medical issue, a personal crisis, or anything else that puts them at risk. There were a few audible gasps, and Linda exchanged a shocked look with another board member. But William, the costs are irrelevant, he interjected firmly. We have more than enough resources to make this happen. And it's not up for debate. This fund will be created. In addition, we'll be launching a new initiative to engage with the communities we operate in, partnering with local shelters, health clinics, and outreach programs. Silence blanketed the room. It was clear they weren't expecting this. William was known for his ruthless efficiency, his focus on the bottom line. What he was proposing went against everything they'd built their business strategy around. Finally, the CFO, Stephen, who was still reeling from their earlier conversation, cleared his throat. William, I understand where you're coming from, Stephen began cautiously, but these are radical changes. The board and our shareholders will have to adjust, William interrupted. He took a deep breath, letting the tension settle before continuing. I need you all to understand something. This isn't just about the company's image, it's about our humanity. I met someone recently, a former employee, someone we failed. He paused, his eyes darkening as he thought of Sarah. She's living on the streets because we didn't have the decency to take care of her when she needed us. We turned our backs on her. I turned my back on her. There was a stunned silence. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. William could see the disbelief, the resistance, but also something else. A flicker of understanding, perhaps even guilt. They weren't heartless, not completely. They'd just lost sight of what really mattered. "I won't let that happen again," he said quietly but firmly. "Not on my watch. We're going to rebuild this company's culture from the ground up, and it starts with how we treat the people who have helped us get here." Linda, still looking somewhat incredulous, glanced around before speaking again. "And how do you plan to implement these changes?" "We'll start by rehiring Sarah Blake," William declared, his voice ringing with finality. "She's going to lead this new initiative. She understands what it's like to be left behind. She knows what needs to change. I trust her to guide us in the right direction." The room erupted in a mix of gasps and murmurs. The idea of bringing back an ex-employee, one who'd been let go under controversial circumstances, seemed outrageous to many. But William stood his ground, his expression unwavering. "Any questions?" he asked, looking around. No one spoke. The weight of his conviction hung heavy in the air, silencing any objections. For the first time in years, William felt a surge of purpose, a sense that he was finally steering the company towards something meaningful, something real. And though the path ahead would be difficult, he was ready to face it. He owed it to Sarah. He owed it to himself. The hum of conversation filled the lobby as employees gathered, casting curious glances at the elevator. Whispers traveled quickly through the office. Someone important was coming back, someone who had once been part of their team. William stood by the entrance, waiting with a mix of nervousness and anticipation. He had made dozens of deals that were worth millions, given countless speeches in front of investors and dignitaries. But today was different. The elevator doors opened and Sarah Blake stepped out. The change in her was immediate. Gone were the worn, grimy clothes and the haunted look in her eyes. She wore a crisp blazer, her hair neatly brushed, and though her face still carried traces of hardship, there was a new strength in her posture. But there was also a hesitancy, as if she were stepping into unfamiliar territory. "Welcome back, Sarah," William said softly, extending his hand. She looked at him, studying his face, searching for any sign of pity or insincerity. Finding none, she nodded slowly and took his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Roberts." "Call me William," he insisted, giving her a small smile. "You're not here as just an employee. You're here to help lead us in a new direction." The employees who had gathered watched in stunned silence as William escorted her into the office. Some of them murmured in confusion, others with mild skepticism. It wasn't often that someone left the company under such circumstances and returned to a position of leadership. But Sarah's presence alone seemed to command a quiet respect, as if she belonged there all along. He led her to the newly created office space on the executive floor, where the words "Community and Employee Outreach" had been freshly engraved on the glass door. A spacious room awaited her, filled with everything she would need to build her new department from scratch. "This is where it starts," William said, gesturing to the room. "Your team will grow and so will your influence. I'm giving you full autonomy to shape this initiative however you see fit." Sarah turned, looking at him carefully. "Why me?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of all the pain and doubts she'd endured. "Why would you put me in charge of this? Because you understand what we're trying to do better than anyone else ever could," William replied. He met her gaze, unwavering. "And because you deserve this chance, to prove to us and to yourself that you can make a difference." For a long moment, Sarah said nothing. Then she took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. "Okay, William, let's do it." He nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. "One last thing," he added gently. "This isn't about charity. You're not a symbol or a statement. You're here because you earned it, and because I believe in you." Her eyes softened, and for the first time in a long while a genuine smile spread across her face. "I'll do my best. I know you will," William said quietly. And with that, a new chapter began, not just for Sarah, but for the entire company. A large crowd gathered in the company's main atrium, the air buzzing with anticipation. Employees filled the space, shoulder to shoulder, murmuring amongst themselves. Camera crews were stationed in every corner, and a low hum of tension underscored the murmurs. This was more than just an internal company event. Word had spread to the media, and everyone was eager to hear what William Roberts, usually so guarded and private, had to say. The lights dimmed slightly as William stepped up to the podium. He stood tall, but there was a distinct difference in his presence. He seemed more grounded, more human. Taking a deep breath, he scanned the faces before him, his employees, his people, the ones he had led with an iron fist and a laser focus on success. But now he was asking them to follow him down a different path, a path of compassion and understanding. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of emotion. "I know many of you are wondering why I called this meeting today, and I'll get right to the point. Over the past few weeks, I've been on a journey that took me far beyond the comfort of my office walls. I went to a place I thought I understood, but I was wrong." There was a ripple of confusion and curiosity in the audience, and William paused, letting the silence build. "Some of you may have noticed that I was away from the company for a while," he continued, choosing his words carefully. "During that time, I stepped out of my role as CEO and into a different reality. I spent time on the streets of this city, not as William Roberts, the businessman, but as someone with nothing to his name, someone who was invisible." Gasps of shock echoed through the room, and all eyes widened in disbelief. Whispers surged, but William pressed on. "It wasn't a publicity stunt," he clarified. "There were no cameras, no one knew who I was. I did it to understand, to truly see the world from a perspective I'd never considered. I met people who had lost everything, people who had been broken by circumstances beyond their control, people like Sarah Blake." He turned slightly, motioning for Sarah to step forward. She approached hesitantly, but as she stood beside him, her shoulders straightened, and she faced the crowd with quiet strength. "Sarah was once one of us," William said softly. "She worked here at Roberts Enterprises until an accident changed everything. And when she needed us the most, we failed her. I failed her. We turned our backs and let her slip through the cracks." A heavy silence settled over the room. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of his words hung in the air like a storm cloud. "But today that changes," he declared, his voice firm. "Today I'm here to announce a new initiative. We're launching a support fund for any employee facing hardship, and we're expanding our outreach to the community around us. No one will be abandoned again, not while I'm in charge." He glanced at Sarah, then back at the crowd. "Sarah has agreed to return to the company and lead this new initiative. She's here not as a charity case, but as a leader, someone who understands what it means to be seen and heard, someone who embodies resilience and strength." The crowd erupted in applause, but William wasn't done. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. "We're not just a company that builds skyscrapers. From now on, we're a company that builds people. That's the legacy I want to leave behind." With that, he stepped back from the podium, and the room exploded in applause. Tears glistened in more than a few eyes, and cameras flashed wildly. But amid the chaos, Sarah turned to William, a look of gratitude and quiet pride on her face. "You did it," she whispered. "No," William replied softly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "We did it." In the months that followed William's speech, Roberts Enterprises underwent a transformation that no one could have predicted. What started as a single initiative quickly blossomed into a sweeping change that rippled throughout the entire company. The new Employee and Community Support Fund became a cornerstone of their operations. It wasn't just a line item on a budget report. It was a living, breathing commitment. Employees who had faced challenges like illness, financial hardship, or family emergencies finally had a safety net. And it wasn't just about money. It was about being heard, being supported, and knowing that the company valued them as human beings first and foremost. Sarah Blake, now the Director of Community and Employee Outreach, dove into her new role with a sense of purpose that inspired everyone around her. She built a team from the ground up, selecting people not just for their qualifications, but for their empathy and dedication to making a difference. Together, they forged partnerships with local shelters, organized volunteer events, and created programs to help current and former employees rebuild their lives. The effect on the company's culture was profound. Employees who once viewed the firm as a cold corporate giant now felt a renewed sense of pride. They saw their work as part of something bigger, something meaningful. Productivity soared, and turnover rates plummeted. More importantly, there was a palpable shift in the air, a sense that Roberts Enterprises was no longer just a business, but a community. William watched these changes unfold with a sense of awe and satisfaction. He attended meetings and listened to stories of employees who had been helped by the new fund, of families who were able to keep their homes or pay medical bills. He heard gratitude in their voices, but also something deeper, a sense of hope and belonging. He spent more time on the ground speaking with staff, hearing their concerns, and showing them that their voices mattered. Each interaction reaffirmed his belief that this was the right path, the only path. He no longer looked down from his office at the city below, disconnected and aloof. Instead, he saw people whose lives he was now truly a part of. And with every small victory, every life changed, William felt himself changing too. The man who had once measured success in profits and acquisitions now found fulfillment in something far more valuable, the knowledge that he was making a real difference. Roberts Enterprises was no longer just his legacy, it was theirs. The sun dipped low over the skyline, casting long shadows across William's office. He stood by the window, looking out at the bustling city below, the very streets where, not long ago, he'd walked as a man stripped of all the trappings of wealth and power. It felt like a lifetime had passed since then, and yet every memory was etched vividly in his mind. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Turning, he saw Sarah standing in the doorway, a small smile on her face. She'd grown into her role beautifully, becoming a voice of compassion and reason within the company. She'd helped transform Roberts Enterprises into something greater than either of them could have imagined. "Got a minute?" she asked, stepping inside. "Of course," William replied, motioning for her to join him by the window. "I was just thinking about how far we've come." Sarah nodded, her gaze following his to the cityscape outside. "It's incredible, really. But it wouldn't have happened without you. You took the first step. You made it possible." William shook his head slowly. "No, Sarah. You're the one who made it real. I might have opened the door, but you're the one who walked through it and brought others with you." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of all they'd accomplished settling between them. Then Sarah glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "So, what's next, William? You've done so much already. What do you want to build now?" William looked at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to chase after the next big project or conquest. The skyscrapers and business deals seemed distant now, insignificant compared to what he'd found in these past few months. "I want to keep building people," he said softly. "To keep finding ways to lift others up, the way we did together. The buildings and profits, they don't matter as much anymore. What matters is what we leave behind in the lives we've touched." Sarah smiled back, a look of understanding and respect in her eyes. "That sounds like a legacy worth leaving." William nodded, turning back to the city with a newfound sense of peace. The journey had been long, painful, and humbling, but it had led him here to a place where he finally felt at home, not in the office or the skyscrapers, but in the connections he'd forged. For the first time, he knew exactly who he was, a man who had once been lost but had found his way back by finding his humanity.